The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. I do not mean the systematic scheme of thought which scholars have doubtfully extracted from his writings. I allude to the wealth of general ideas scattered through them. His personal endowments, his wide opportunities for experience at a great period of civilization, his inheritance of an intellectual tradition not yet stiffened by excessive systematization, have made his writings an inexhaustible mine of suggestion. Alfred North Whitehead. Over the course of the centuries following the advent of Christianity, Western philosophy has oftentimes experienced itself as standing in a rather ambivalent relationship to the Platonic tradition of thought. During the 13th century, medieval scholastic philosophers would call into question the independent reality of forms, thus signaling what would seem to be a radical departure from Christendom's own Neoplatonic origins. Later, René Descartes would attempt to upend the authority of Platonic and, by extension, Aristotelian philosophy through his regrounding of epistemology within radically perspectival, subjectivistic skepticism. Later still, Friedrich Nietzsche would attempt to even more radically distance himself from this Platonic heritage. Nietzsche would come to invert the central Platonic duality of immanence and transcendence, body and soul, earth and sky, particular and universal, by developing a metaphysics of embodied power within which the celestial, suprasensory realm was understood to be a contingent projection of embodied human subjectivity. The Platonic tradition had seen the formative realm to be more ontologically foundational, more really real, than the immanent world of mere appearance. The eternal, unchanging, universal forms were seen as the ultimate, underlying reality, while the immanent, sensorial world was regarded as a realm of transient, imperfect, impure shadows of the divine. Nietzschean metaphysics conversely attempted to radically reconfigure this cosmology, such that embodied subjectivity was seen to be that which is of the utmost ontological primacy, while Platonic philosophy had tended to regard the bodily realm, and by extension, personal subjective experience, as morally ambiguous at best and as illusory, chaotic malevolence at worst. Nietzsche instead came to see this denial of bodily existence as a rejection of life itself, which was rooted in an inability to affirm the value of existence in the face of human suffering. And yet, despite how radically and even viciously anti-Platonic Nietzsche's metaphysics may superficially seem, we find that even Nietzsche was never truly able to wriggle himself out from beneath the very long and very heavy shadow of the Platonic spirit. As Martin Heidegger came to see in his extensive analyses of Nietzsche's work, everything anti is held fast in the essence of that which it moves against. Nietzsche's philosophy is indeed an inverted form of Platonism, but due to that very inversion, Nietzsche's philosophy does not escape Platonism, but rather his philosophy becomes a black mirror, into which the Platonic tradition, still very alive within Nietzsche himself, was forced to gaze into its own abyssal darkness. This video is going to be about the incorrigible, omnipresent, and ultimately inescapable Platonic spirit of Western philosophy. As we shall see more clearly moving forward, all Western thought is either consciously or unconsciously Neoplatonic in essence. But more specifically, this video is going to be about the very darkness of God which Nietzsche wrestled with throughout his entire life. As we shall see, Nietzsche's struggle with this abyss was in fact the reenactment of a fundamental tension, a fundamental paradox which has resided within the inner fathoms of the Platonic tradition since its very inception, an inner instability which has in fact been the central engine that has driven the development of Western philosophy as a whole, even unto the present day. Alright guys, so before launching further into this, I want to take a moment to talk about today's sponsor, which is The Monad by Gallo Glass Books. So this is a compilation of works by Plotinus, Porphyry, and Proclus, or as I like to refer to them, the Triple P Gang Gang. It also has an introduction written by Ken Wheeler from the channel Theoria Apophasis, which is really cool. And if you're not familiar with his channel, you should totally check it out, because if you get this and you're reading the introduction and you're not reading it in Ken Wheeler's voice, then you're doing it wrong. So there are only 2,000 copies of this made. It's a limited edition run, and about 1,300 have already been sold, which means if you can get your hands on one of these, then you've got your hands on a collector's item. And moreover, this is the kind of book that is really great as a gift or just something to get for yourself, because it's the kind of book that feels really well made. The artistry is great, the illustrations, it feels solid and sturdy, like the kind of book that just kind of demands that you actually take it off the shelf and read the damn thing. So anyway, links in the description, and without any further ado, back to the video. In many ways, we could see all Platonic philosophy as a metaphysics of light. Light is that which discloses the world by rendering it intelligible through illumination, and within Platonic thought, intelligibility and being are considered to be effectively, if not quite literally, identical. The light produced by terrestrial and celestial fires was seen as the outer expression of the light cast by the nous, a term which we can roughly approximate as intellect. Within Hellenistic cosmologies, the nous is the faculty of the human organism which is shared with the divine. While the body experiences sensations of the outer, contingent realm of appearance, it is the nous which is able to cognize the forms which give shape to reality. The human nous, therefore, discloses the truth of the world through its prehension of the forms which inform the world, while the divine cosmic nous is that which discloses the world itself through sculpting the world from the abyssal chaos of formless nothingness. Aristotle tells us that sensorial light is a potency which is able to transmute potential colors into actualized colors, and that the nous operates in much the same manner, but in a much more subtle way, by transmuting potential experiences of truth into actualized noesis. Even prior to the birth of Hellenistic philosophy, fire and light were often seen to constitute the most primordial forms of existence. Living bodies grow and expand, and are characterized by a softness which derives from the animating power of water. Dead bodies, conversely, stop moving and become rigid and dry. Living bodies, at least those of higher organisms, hold themselves aloft above the surface of the earth, while dead bodies come to be subsumed into the mineralized underworld. The seemingly inanimate mineral world was thus associated with the past, and the past was understood to be the consequent activity of the eternal realm. The bodily composition of nature, in other words, consisted of events which had already occurred within the transient flow of becoming, and such past events were informed by the activity of that which is eternal, that which transcends or stands above the realm of manifestation. That which was higher was therefore that which was closer to the eternal realm which nature was generated from, while the lower was that which was further away. Seemingly inert mineral objects were considered to be the least animate constituents of the world, in the sense that they were the furthest removed from the animating power of the eternal divinity. Here we can begin to see the basic outline of what we today might refer to as alchemical or elemental thought, though we must keep in mind that such elemental thinking goes far, far deeper than medieval alchemy, and even much deeper than Hellenistic philosophy itself. Elemental earth is that which has achieved greatest stability. It is the most complete and therefore the least motile. It is the past as well as the continuity or inertia of the past. And it is, of course, the realm of the dead or underworld. Water is that which animates all biological organisms. Unlike mineral objects, water does not maintain rigid boundaries between internal and external, and therefore the water element is able to flow through life forms indiscriminately as a vitalizing potency which is able to weave organisms together into the complex metabolic circulations of ecological symbiosis. Air is pneuma and prana, the breath of life which human beings share in common with the animal kingdom, but not the mineral or plant kingdoms. Air is even more subtle than water in that it is not drawn downward by gravity, nor does it resist changes in its density in the way that water does. The mobility and fluidity of the breath of life is thus transferred to the animals which breathe it. Unlike plants, animal bodies are not tethered to the earth. Their motion is not dictated by vital processes of growth, but rather by the power of sentient agency. Finally, fire stands out among all other elements for a variety of reasons. Unlike the other elements, which are able to sustain themselves within the natural world of their own bodily inertia, fire instead requires fuel in order to maintain itself within the terrestrial domain. Fire demands sacrifice, as it were, as fire is not native to the terrestrial world. Upon the surface of the earth, fire is a stranger in a strange land, but above us, we can see that fire is the primary constituent of the celestial world. The sun and stars are beings of divine, inextinguishable fires. When fires burn here on Earth, they move upwards, attempting to return to their ultimate origin. Among the vast diversity of the Earth's biological organisms, there is but one creature which has attained mastery over fire, and that is, of course, the human being. Just as manifest fire produces sensorial light, the inner fire of the human nous produces the subtle light, which, appropriately, then allowed us to subordinate terrestrial fires to our will, and thus allowed us to create a distinctly human world which differentiated itself from the purely natural world. Light, even more subtle even than fire, is therefore that which is most characteristic of the divine realm of eternal forms. Light itself is not considered among the four classical elements because, unlike the other four elements, light was seen to be fundamentally spirit, rather than a modality of matter. By discerning the archetypal nature of light, therefore, we can begin to see the most fundamental core of Western Platonic consciousness, and we can see this inner nature of light most clearly by examining it in contrast to its polar counterpart, darkness. In a dark room, we can see that a fundamental characteristic of darkness is homogeneity. No matter where we look, we see only the same, perfectly uniform blackness. Light, however, cuts through this uniformity, whereas darkness seemingly flows through boundaries in complete disregard for delineations of internal and external. Light is reflected by such boundaries, or absorbed as heat. It is therefore through the discernment of light in contrast to the indifference of darkness which allows light to inform the formless. Light can therefore be understood as the most fundamental modality of formative potency, that which facilitates the manifestation of forms such as colors and images. Light is thus understood to be the most primordial form of order, intelligibility, and therefore being itself, in contrast to the chaos, undifferentiation, and nothingness of darkness. Within the Neoplatonic cosmology of Plotinus, the monad, otherwise known as source or simply as the one, is regarded as the most primordial and ontologically ultimate form of pure being. The monad is the ultimate core of existence itself, which conditions the underlying unity of all manifest reality. According to Plotinus, all things are and can only be expressions of the primordial monad, as it is the will of the monad which preconditions the possibility of all manifestation. The monad is the Platonic form of the good. It is ultimate unity, and it is also the will unto the realization of ultimate unity. As we can see, the Neoplatonic metaphysics of figures such as Plotinus and Pseudo-Dionysius would build upon earlier Platonic thought so as to form the germ of what would eventually become the Christian theological tradition. This fundamental duality of light and darkness, being and nothingness, form and formlessness, is the most fundamental core of all Western thought, whether philosophical or theological, scientific or spiritual, classical or postmodern, explicit or unspoken. And yet, we can also see that this is not a perfectly symmetrical duality. Being is regarded as that which creates the world, whereas nothingness is an entirely passive absence of being. The primordial monad, the ultimate embodiment of being and light, is also the ultimate form of harmonious oneness. It is value itself, and therefore darkness and chaos, by contrast, can seemingly be nothing more than the privation of value. What could darkness possibly be other than the mere absence of light? What could nothingness possibly be other than mere vacuity? The absence of God. This imbalance, however, would give rise to a number of deeply fundamental, paradoxical, and seemingly intractable complications of Platonic cosmology. We see these paradoxes begin to emerge within Plato's Timaeus, as Plato attempts to contend with manifest nature and its relationship to eternal, unmanifest divinity. Here, Plato introduces the notion of the chora, a kind of receptacle much akin to the notion of empty space, which must precondition the possibility of nature and becoming. In order for the forms to participate in a world, then there must be something which underlies the world, which the forms are able to manifest themselves into. Quote, "The chora is everlasting and indestructible. It grants an abode to all created things, but in itself the chora is to be apprehended with non-sensation, by a sort of bastard reckoning, which is hardly trustworthy. Looking unto this chora, we dream and affirm that it is necessary that all things be somewhere in some place and occupy some receptacle, but that which is neither on earth nor anywhere in the heavens is nothingness. So likewise it is right that the substance fit to receive over its whole extent the images of all things intelligible and eternal should itself of its own nature be void of all form. Therefore let us not speak of her, this mother and receptacle of this generated world, by the names of earth or air or fire or water or any aggregates or constituents thereof. Rather, if we describe her as a kind invisible and unshaped, all-receptive, and in some utterly perplexing and most baffling manner partaking of the intelligible, we shall describe her truly." Plato, the Timaeus. If you watched my previous video essay on the transhumanist death cult, then you can likely now begin to see how this story picks up where that one left off. What Plato is grappling with here is, quite explicitly, the Great Mother Goddess, which we have seen depicted as Tiamat within Sumerian cosmogony. The formless mother, which seems to utterly defy the very intelligibility which Plato has identified as the essence of existence itself, and which, quite paradoxically, seems to nonetheless be an absolutely necessary condition for the possibility of the world which we actually inhabit. Plato refers to the chora as a third category of existence, or rather non-existence, as it defies categorization as either form or appearance. Forms are apprehended through noesis, and yet the chora must be utterly lacking in form and thus cannot be an object of noetic perception. Bodily sensations, conversely, detect particular manifestations of form within the bodily realm, and yet the chora must also be utterly empty and lacking in the delineations which separate and define bodily entities. If this formless mother cannot be an object of either the sensory or spiritual faculties, then how can we possibly even speak of it at all? It seems that there is an immensely fundamental mystery at play within these passages of the Timaeus. Plato speaks of this ultimate darkness with a tone of ambivalence or even somber resignation, as the chora would seem to be that which stubbornly stands in utter defiance of Plato's metaphysical matrix, and yet which remains utterly indispensable within that very cosmology. Within Aristotle's physics, however, we see intimations that this mystery of ultimate nothingness extends even further than is made explicit within the Timaeus. Quote, Plato says in the Timaeus that matter and the chora are the same, for the receptive and the chora are one and the same. Although the manner in which he speaks of the chora in the Timaeus does differ from that in the so-called unwritten teachings, he nevertheless does declare that location and chora are identical. In other words, it would seem that Plato's notorious unwritten teachings, those which were reserved for only the most fully initiated of his students, contained knowledge of this divine darkness which are not found within the Socratic dialogues. Unfortunately, I do not have access to those unwritten teachings due to the fact that my application for the Illuminati is still being reviewed, but luckily we can do more here than simply speculate as to what the ultimate mysteries of the chora must be. Here we will once again return to Plotinus, and in particular his writings which pertain to the nature of matter. As indicated by Aristotle above, Hellenistic philosophy did not regard matter as a classification of physical objects or substances, but rather matter referred to the formlessness which was informed so as to become the natural world. In other words, matter, a word which shares a close etymological connection with the word mother, was taken to refer to the very same formless chora described by Plato. What Plotinus sets himself in search of within the Enneads is what later alchemists would refer to as the prima materia, the underlying substrate, as it were, from which the natural world must be sculpted by the noetic light of the higher realms. Plotinus argues that this prima materia cannot simply be a category or modality of existence, as we might say of the four classical elements, for example, because this formlessness cannot possibly endow entities with any properties. Being utterly vacuous in itself, it cannot inform existing things in the world. Even more so than Plato, Plotinus regards the prima materia with a kind of moral indignation. He seems to almost chastise the darkness for defying intelligibility, and yet refusing to simply dissolve into irrelevance. He states that whatever this nothingness tells us is a lie, that whatever it pretends to be, it is not. It is, in other words, pure seeming, pure appearance, as it were. As such, Plotinus is suggesting that this abyssal void is that which allows the noumenal, formative reality to manifest as mere appearance. The prima materia, or chora, might thus be understood as a pure apparentness, which is not itself a form, but rather a formlessness which forms lose themselves into, thereby creating images which are less intelligible and less fully real. This void would therefore seem to be the very imperfection which differentiates the world of becoming from the world of forms. Plotinus then comes to a very curious conclusion. He infers that the prima materia, or chora, within an entity is in fact an inherent negativity, or negation, which is intrinsic to all manifest beings within the natural world. The cora within a manifest object is therefore the invisibility of the object's interior, the blackness of the colors which remain mere potentiality within a pitch-dark room. It is the undecidedness of a decision which has not yet been made, the unmanifestness, as it were, of that which has yet to be informed, that which has yet to be disclosed through the luminosity of noesis. Here I want us to take a slight detour from Plotinus and examine a line of reasoning developed by a much more recent metaphysician, the 19th and 20th century philosopher Henri Bergson. In his text Matter and Memory, Bergson grapples with the friction between metaphysical naturalism and idealism, and attempts to carve a path through that impasse by re-examining the notion of matter, which has become one of the most central and most highly ambiguous concepts within the modern scientific worldview. Bergson notes the way in which matter tends to be conceptualized as that which somehow resides underneath or behind our phenomenological experiences of the world. I can look at an object, such as a candle, from a variety of different angles or in different lighting conditions. I can examine its weight, texture, and color, but each of these observations will be, by definition, experiences of matter, not the matter itself, as matter is said to be the objective reality of the candle. Our actual empirical experiences of the candle would seem to consist of no more than subjective sensations. If matter is defined as pure objectivity, then it would seem to be ever beyond our reach, as our conscious experiences of the world are necessarily subjective. We might then conclude that there simply is no matter after all, and instead lean into an idealistic interpretation in which the subjective sensations are exhaustive of reality. This conclusion, however, seems unsatisfactory in that it would seem incapable of accounting for the continuity of sensory experiences. If there is no matter which underlies my sensations of the candle, then why do these sensations seem to adhere to an underlying order? Why do the sensations of light and warmth always re-emerge when I leave the room and return if there is nothing beneath those sensations which conditions their manifestation? Bergson resolves this paradox by concluding that if the word matter does not refer to our particular sensations of the candle, then there is only one other referent to which that term might apply, namely to potential sensations. Bergson thereby infers that the matter of the candle consists in the expressions of the candle which are as yet unmanifest, sensations of warmth which have not yet been felt, sensations of light and color which have not yet been seen, feelings of weight and texture which have not yet been felt. To use Kantian terms, we could say that the noumenal candle consists of a field or phase space of potential phenomenological manifestations. Thus, we can see that Bergson's analysis points us towards the exact same conclusion suggested by Plotinus. The materiality of the candle consists precisely in its darkness, and the aspects of its being which remain undisclosed. But here we can also begin to see the boundaries of Platonic thought itself begin to blur. We do indeed experience the materiality of the candle, but this materiality is experienced by the mind, or nous, not by our sensory organs, as this materiality is by definition behind the sensory impressions which our bodily organs encounter. As previously noted, Plato suggested that formlessness could not be grasped by noesis, as it is an ambiguous non-something which is devoid of conceptual contents. But when we apprehend the materiality of the candle, this is indeed a noetic, conceptual experience. It would therefore seem that we are only able to encounter this formless cora insofar as its indeterminacy is conjugated with formative powers. The materiality of the candle is not experienced as an amorphous blob of pure potentiality. Rather, this is a field of potentiality which itself is characterized by a well-defined morphology. The possibility space of potential flickerings of the flame is not fully determinate, but it is not utterly indeterminate either. It is a composite image, as it were, in which certain possibilities are more readily available than others, and, significantly, in which contradictory possibilities are able to overlap with one another. Here I want us to make yet another detour, this time by looking at the works of the 19th century German metaphysician Friedrich Schelling. One of the most central concepts found within Schelling's cosmological thought is that of the groundless ground of existence, which we might otherwise refer to as the abground. This abground is yet another conception of divine darkness, one which Schelling derives from earlier German thinkers such as the 16th century mystic Jakob Boehme and the 13th century theologian Meister Eckhart. Schelling was a contemporary of Hegel, another philosopher for whom the notion of negativity was of central importance. But one significant manner in which Schelling's metaphysics differed from that of Hegel was in Schelling's notion of indifference. While Schelling and Hegel both prominently attend to notions of identity, contradiction, negation, and nothingness, Schelling comes to conceptualize difference in a much more nuanced manner, by considering the conditions needed for the suspension of negation. In order for differences to exist and thus allow for the natural world of change and diversity, contradictions between distinct entities must somehow be allowed to sustain themselves. For object A to be different than object B, then object B must also be not A. If this is indeed the case, then we might conclude that objects A and B must necessarily annihilate one another unless there is something at play which can allow this contradiction of selfhood and otherness to maintain itself. In order for there to truly be a cosmos, a unity in which differences are able to coexist in solidarity, then there must be a hidden fourth, as it were, which is not selfhood, otherness, or unity. For Schelling, this missing link is the abground, which Schelling characterizes as a form of undifferentiated no-thingness, which, much like Plato's Chora, is understood as a sort of vessel within which the seeds of the natural world can come to germinate. The contradictions of distinct self-identities are able to coexist and conjugate within the world specifically due to the very indifference, or rather undifference, which both underlies such separate entities and which is also contained within them. As we saw previously in our examinations of light and darkness, light either reflects off of the boundaries of other entities or transforms them through the transfer of heat. Darkness, conversely, is completely indifferent to such delineations. When the light recedes, darkness engulfs and inundates all things with complete disregard to the boundaries of identity. The light of the sun can obscure the stars, but the very passivity of darkness allows for the multiplicity of stars to be simultaneously visible. In one sense, this might seem to be just obvious. Distinct entities are able to coexist because they occupy different locations within space. The Chora, in other words, facilitates difference in the form of spatial extension, but we must also realize that this undifference of outer space is also complemented by an undifference of inner space as well. Returning to our previous observations, recall that within the phase space of possible manifestations, which is in fact the materiality of the candle, we can see that a range of contradictory possibilities are able to be suspended alongside one another without negating one another. To now borrow from Schelling, we can say that this suspension of contradiction is facilitated by the very undifference of the abground, or Chora, which resides within the candle. It is the very no-thingness of the Cora which allows for the multiplicity we find within the world of becoming. As the above examples already indicate, this Platonic theme of light and darkness is one which spans across the full scope of Western philosophical history. But in order to better understand the full significance of this, let us now once again return to the world of classical Neoplatonism. As we have already begun to see, the darkness of the Cora can be understood as a kind of pure potentiality, one which becomes carved down, as it were, into more defined morphological spaces through the ingression of formative elements. This darkness is characterized by an utterly undifferentiated homogeneity. It is also understood to be necessarily uncreated, as creation necessarily involves the endowment of form. The formless Cora must therefore be an eternal condition for the possibility of all existing things. Paradoxically, these would seem to be the exact same characteristics which the Neoplatonists ascribe to their primordial monad. Much like the Cora, the monad is said to be an ultimate, eternal oneness which preconditions all existence. How could it possibly be that in their innermost essences, ultimate being and ultimate nothingness would seem to share the exact same properties? Furthermore, this monad itself should be all-inclusive. There should not be anything separate from it, as all things are said to be generated through emanation from the monad. In other words, the Cora, the ultimate of formless darkness, chaos, illusion, and non-being, should be contained within the monad's own ultimacy of light, order, truth, and realness. Returning now briefly to the 19th century, we can see this paradox even more explicitly in Hegel's search for pure being. Hegel asks us to consider an object, such as your own body, let's say, and then asks us to consider what exactly the being of this entity amounts to. What exactly is the power at play here that results in the realness of your body? What differentiates an actual body from one which is merely conceptual or imaginary? A purely conceptual version of your body could have all of the same determinate properties, such as weight, color, shape, and texture, while nonetheless remaining non-real in contrast to your actual body. Thus, we can infer that the being of your body does not consist in any of these determinations. Your body's being is not its weight, shape, colors, or textures, and so we must go deeper in search of being. Yet, no matter how deeply we look into ourselves, we seem to find nothing other than determinations which could equally be properties of an imaginary body. Once we have stripped down an entity of all its determinations in search of its being, what we find ourselves to be left with is, paradoxically, nothingness. Hegel thus concludes that being and nothingness are both fundamentally characterized by undifferentiated indeterminacy. What makes your body real is in fact that it is an intersection of being and nothingness. Considered in themselves, being and nothingness are revealed to be two sides of the same coin, the male and female poles, as it were, of one and the same primordial syzygy. But there is one crucial insight here that we must not overlook. Conceptual and physical existence may be distinct, but the conceptual itself is more than pure nothingness. The being of your physical body is the negation of outer nothingness, while the being of the imaginary body within your mind is the negation of inner nothingness. The Renaissance artist Michelangelo stated that every block of stone has a statue within it, and it is the task of the sculptor to discover it. Michelangelo's words are more than a mere poetic inflection, as they present us with an immense metaphysical transformation of human awareness. Michelangelo's statement points us towards the paradox of form and formlessness, and to the manner in which this Platonic duality would begin to re-territorialize itself during the age of European Christendom. Plato and his successors conceptualized the world of forms, or hyper-Uranian realm, as existing above and beyond space and time, within an unchanging, pristine anachronon, which transcends all of nature and which stands in diametric opposition to the abyssal darkness of the Chora. Yet Michelangelo's statement would seem to suggest that the forms which are revealed by creative activity are actually contained precisely within the darkness of the world. The statue of David exists not in some unreachable realm beyond human experience, but rather it is found within the very indeterminacy or inner darkness of the unformed marble. A solid block of marble contains within its own formlessness all of the statues which could possibly be carved from it. Yet, as this formlessness came to participate with Michelangelo's own inner awareness, this moment of phenomenological disclosure revealed the latent statue of David specifically. Elaborating upon this insight, we could say that the Chora in itself contains the entirety of all real potentialities. Recalling once more the insights of Friedrich Schelling, we can see moreover that it is the very undifference of this abyssal, groundless ground which allows these disparate, mutually contradictory forms to reside in solidarity with one another. It is also no mere accident that we see this metaphysical insight expressed by a Renaissance artist. Transformations of human consciousness always begin with artists, and only later do these evolutionary developments come to be explicitly articulated by metaphysicians. It is only later still that these novel forms come to solidify, such that they are able to enter into the unconscious chattering of statesmen, rhetoricians, and academic scholars. Looking to the Renaissance period, we see numerous monumental transformations begin to unfold. And one of the most radical developments which we can observe here is the birth of perspectivity within visual art. Within perspectival art forms, we can see humanity coming to an awareness of the inner space of private subjectivity, as well as the correlative outer space of expansive emptiness. In order to understand the significance of this development, however, we must first take a moment to recognize what visual art itself actually is. Looking upon this perspectival shift through the lens of contemporary consciousness, we might be tempted to say that perspectival art is more realistic than earlier forms of art which lack such perspectivity. This, however, would be a very crude misunderstanding, as it fails to consider just how historically conditioned our own understanding of realism actually is. Every genuine artwork attempts to capture the essence of that which is rendered. When we look at artworks which are allegedly more stylized, what we are actually seeing is a different understanding of what is most essential, most real, and most valuable. The techniques of visual art are both ontological and valuative, moral gestures. We see earlier non-perspectival forms of art as less realistic because we have come to take for granted a metaphysical disposition within which subjective sensation is regarded as that which is most fully real. Within classical Platonic philosophy, the world of appearance is regarded as ontologically deficient in relation to the conceptual domain. A perspectival painting captures the manner in which the object of the painting is encountered by human sensory faculties. Such artwork is therefore an ontological and valuative affirmation of such immanent experience. An affirmation which would have seemed utterly absurd within the Hellenistic life world, and indeed within all such life worlds, prior to the metamorphoses which began to take shape during the Renaissance. This implication that subjective, immanent sensation was more than a mere shadow was something radically novel and represents a dialectical reconfiguration which was beginning to utterly recreate the collective unconscious of the Western world. In order to understand this metamorphosis, we must now turn to the single most crucial and titanic event within the evolutionary journey of Platonic philosophy. the mystery of Golgotha. What we see depicted in the story of Christ is the incarnation of the cosmic Logos, the immanent manifestation of the cosmic will, which animates and conditions the ultimate destiny of the world. Within the context of classical Platonic cosmology, this narrative is almost nonsensically paradoxical. The monad of Platonic cosmology is an ultimate form, one of eternal, pristine purity and perfection, which is as far removed as possible from the dirty, impure, contingent, and fleeting world of death, decay, and illusion which immanent human experience finds itself within. The notion that this ideal of ultimate value could become most fully manifest within the life and death of an entirely ordinary, particular human being would seem to be utterly absurd, but it is precisely within this paradox that we find a cosmic revelation of world-making and world-unmaking immensity, one which would condition the metamorphosis which we see in the European Renaissance, and by extension would condition the eventual emergence of modernity as such. Here we must ask ourselves, what exactly could be the meaning of this archetypal paradox, within which the highest transcendental power is revealed to be most fully realized within the destitute life and brutal execution of a vagabond? How exactly could it be that the highest value which animates the cosmos as a whole could find its most ultimate expression in the human experience of immanent life and death? Building upon the insights of Hegel regarding being, nothingness, and their intrinsic relationship to human awareness, the Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek describes human subjectivity as, quote, a void of self-relating negativity. Human awareness itself, that is to say, is entirely lacking in formative contents, and is therefore a kind of emptiness which is only able to achieve a kind of quasi-existence in a strictly relational manner. This might seem to be yet another impossibly paradoxical claim. We post-Cartesians tend to regard our consciousness as that which is most certain and most definitively real. Yet, if we begin to strip away the various contents of our awareness in search of pure awareness itself, what we find, much like in Hegel's quest for pure being, is in fact pure nothingness. Žižek further elaborates by building upon the insights of yet another German phenomenologist, Johann Fichte. Building upon the insights of Immanuel Kant, Fichte tells us that subjectivity is a kind of recursive self-positing. The conceptual contents of the thought, I am, are characterized exclusively by self-referentiality. The I, which is being referred to, is in fact the thought of I am. The I amness is in effect a self-generative loop. But Žižek then introduces a Hegelian complication to Fichte's thought. In order for this I amness to point towards itself, it must somehow delineate itself in contrast to that which it is not. The I of I amness can only be comprehensible to itself and therefore actualized, insofar as it implicates an otherness, which it can be set against in a manner which is very similar to what we see within Hegel's master-slave dialectic. The void of subjectivity effectively negates itself into being by negating its own identity with otherness. The pure, homogeneous oneness of otherness is carved into, as it were, thus forming the membrane through which the subject is able to achieve ontological definition. Subjectivity is therefore a negation of negation, a hole, as it were, within the purely negative emptiness of the chora's formlessness. Subjectivity is, as Žižek tells us, less than nothing. This negation of nothingness then gives rise to the most fundamental polarity of existence, that of outer space and inner space, the corporeal and the noetic. One piece of this puzzle remains yet missing, however, and that is the distinction between subjectivity and pure awareness itself. In order for the subjectivity of I amness to actually experience its own self-positing, it must be characterized by a receptivity which can facilitate such reflection. In other words, subjectivity cannot generate its own experientiality whole cloth from inanimate non-consciousness. There must already be a background of pre-subjective experience which subjectivity can carve itself out of. In order for private internal experience to be possible, the membrane of subjective interiority must come to being within a field of transpersonal awareness. Receptivity requires formlessness. A mirror is able to reflect images precisely due to the fact that it does not project an image of its own surface. The surface of a mirror is immensely smooth, homogeneous, and thus there is very little texture, which can conflict with images deflected by it. It is the very formlessness of the mirror's surface which allows for such reflection. The notion of subjective awareness has become so thoroughly centralized within modern consciousness that it is almost impossible for us to imagine just how recent this notion actually is. If you ask a person what they believe themselves to be most fundamentally, they will likely tell you that they are their consciousness, that they are the inner space of personal experientiality within which the contents of their experience are able to come to presence. Returning once again to classical Platonic philosophy, we find no such notion of subjective awareness. Plato's metaphysical anatomy of the human organism includes the body, which makes contact with the realm of appearance, and the nous, which makes contact with the world of the forms. But nowhere in traditional Platonic thought do we find the notion of a private, internal receptacle of experiences which we could equivocate with the modern notion of subjectivity. Within Platonic cosmology, the human soul is itself a kind of form, not an inner space or receptacle within which experiences of form can occur. There is no I amness within traditional Platonic philosophy, at least not explicitly. A fish which lives its entire life within water is not going to regard water as a distinct object of concern. It is simply a given within the fish's world. Likewise, within classical Platonic philosophy, awareness as such is never regarded as an aspect of reality which is distinct from being itself. It is only after the subjectivistic shift of the Renaissance period that Western thought could come to regard experientiality as something which might not simply be a given of existence itself. Only after the discovery of private, inner awareness were we able to call into question whether such awareness existed beyond the boundary of our own subjectivity. Returning again to the Renaissance, it is precisely such an inner space that we find coming to presence within perspectival art. Here we find that human subjectivity is coming to experience itself as an inner sanctum of personal subjectivity. Within the metaphysics of René Descartes, we find this transformation of awareness given explicit articulation. Descartes transforms the Platonic duality of form and appearance into the modern duality of mind and matter, within which mind is conceptualized as an inner space of subjective awareness, and matter is characterized by extension through physical outer space. Perspectival art implicates a kind of horizontal pyramid, within which the apex of this invisible pyramid vanishes into the focal point of the subjective field of view, and the body of the pyramid radiates outward into an indefinite space, an expansive emptiness within which subjective sensations might come to be disclosed. The traditional Platonic cosmology is itself a kind of pyramid, but within Platonism, the apex of this pyramid is understood to be the monad, or source of ultimate transcendental unity. The world of appearance and thus immanent sensation was understood to be the bottommost stratum of this metaphysical hierarchy, that which was furthest removed from the ultimate transcendence of the monad. The perspectival shift of the Renaissance would thus seem to have taken this Platonic pyramid and transformed it into a bizarre parody of itself, one in which the nexus of immanent subjectivity has come to replace the transcendental monad as the cosmological ultimate. The 20th century German phenomenologist Martin Heidegger comes to precisely this conclusion in his analysis of René Descartes' metaphysical framework. Descartes' philosophy was grounded in a radically subjectivistic skepticism, one which reconceptualized truth as subjective certainty. Descartes saw that which was most fundamental and most real as that which was most indubitable to his own consciousness, and thus attempted to ground his entire philosophical enterprise within the security of his own self-awareness, within the notorious "I think, therefore I am." Heidegger tells us that within Descartes' inward turn, what we see is a resituating of the ontological ground of becoming, which the Greeks would have referred to as the hypokaimenon, that which is most underlying of all existing things, and which the properties of existing things are able to adhere within, the being of beings, as it were. Throughout the pre-Socratic and Neoplatonic traditions, the hypokaimenon would come to manifest in a variety of ways, from the eternal fires of Heraclitus to the chora of Plato, eventually becoming the prima materia of Aristotle and subsequent alchemical traditions. Within the subjectivistic shift of the Renaissance period, which we see explicated in the works of Descartes, this hypokaimenon comes to be finally identified, although somewhat covertly, with subjective human experience. The underlying paradox of transcendence and immanence comes to collapse into itself as the lowest form of immanence, private subjectivity, comes to be implicitly identified with the role of the highest form of ultimate transcendental unity. As we shall see, this metaphysical transformation, which we see taking place during the Renaissance period, is a direct and necessary consequence of the cosmic paradox, which we find within the incarnation of Christ. Although we do not find an explicit notion of pure awareness or subjectivity as such within traditional Platonic philosophy, we do find a notion of pure awareness within Indic philosophy. Within Indic metaphysics, one of the most central notions is that Atman is Brahman, that all individual entities in the world are in fact outer manifestations of the entirely transpersonal awareness of ultimate reality. The notion of Brahman represents an absolutely homogeneous and vacuous oneness, a void of pure potentiality, as it were, which is in many ways identical to Plato's chora. At least on one level, we can take the life of Christ to represent a closing of the Ouroboros loop of transcendence and immanence, which incorporates just such an insight that pure awareness itself is both ultimate transcendence and ultimate immanence, that the ultimate oneness of the transcendental monad is in fact the very same ultimate oneness of the dark, groundless ground, which is in fact the void of experientiality. Christic metaphysics, however, would come to diverge from the Indic tradition in one absolutely fundamental way. Although Indic metaphysics is grounded in a notion of ultimate oneness, Indic philosophy does not contain a notion of ultimate unity, which preserves difference. Indic cosmology is cyclic in that all things emerge from the same source of undifferentiated oneness, and the ultimate destiny of all things is to simply return to this state of undifferentiated homogeneity. We do find a polarity of transcendence and immanence within Indic philosophy, but within Indic philosophy this is understood as a distinction between oneness and separation, not the distinction between form and appearance or between light and darkness which we find within the Platonic tradition. The goal of Indic spirituality, therefore, is in transcending the illusory nature of separation and differentiation, such that the individual Atman can be liberated from the veil of Maya and Samsara and reunite with its origin through the dissolution of differences. Indic cosmology is thus an infinite, repetitive cycle of differentiation and eventual disintegration into the underlying oneness of Brahman. Within Western metaphysics, however, the understanding of transcendence as form rather than homogeneous oneness led to a very different understanding of the highest value of existence. Rather than the cosmic telon or formative attractor being seen as the return to undifferentiated oneness, the ultimate form of the monad could instead be conceptualized as an ultimate unity, which was able to maintain distinctions within itself while synthesizing such distinct entities into a greater wholeness. To borrow a phrase from Alfred North Whitehead, the many become one and are increased by one. The one which the many are increased by is the unity which they achieve through their mutual integration. The one which the entire cosmos is increased by through such integration is the monad. The monad is both the form of unity as well as the actualized unity, which the cosmos comes to achieve through its continual self-generation. Within the Christian narrative, it is not only the raw, transpersonal awareness of the Korah which is redeemed, but also the particularity of human individuality, the vacuous less-than-nothingness of individual subjectivity. The mystery of Golgotha reveals that the separate subjectivities of individual human beings, and by extension the immanent world of embodied existence itself, does not stand in contradiction to the ultimate unity of the transcendental monad. Rather, we instead see that the cosmic attractor, the will of the divine, is a will unto the generation of an ultimate harmonic unity, which not only includes but in fact necessitates difference and separation. The polarity of consonance and dissonance in musicology can help to elucidate this distinction. Consonance is a principle of order, while dissonance is a principle of disorder. The most consonant musical interval is the unison, in which two identical notes are played simultaneously. The second most consonant interval is the octave, in which one note is exactly double the frequency of the other. As we continue to examine different intervals, we will see that greater separation results in greater dissonance. Ultimate consonance, therefore, would amount to a single note which is accompanied by nothing and which never changes. A simple, solid tone which we could hardly even describe as music. Traditional Indic music is monophonic. A single melody is played in which the melody deviates from an initial tonic note and explores a given scale before eventually resolving back to the tonic. Symbolically, we could understand this as the oneness of Brahman separating into the various non-tonic notes which represent the individual beings of the created world, which then ultimately return to Brahman. Western music, however, has instead tended towards polyphonic harmony, in which multiple melodies are played simultaneously so as to form chords and chord progressions. Over the course of Western musical history, composers have attempted to create ever more intense forms of musical morphology by incorporating ever greater forms of difference into their compositions. Three-note triadic chords would become the much larger chords of jazz harmony and chordal harmony. Chord progressions would become increasingly elaborate and would begin to transition through a variety of distinct key signatures within a single piece. What we see expressed here is an absolutely central feature of the Western collective unconscious. The insight that the ultimate cosmic attractor is not a will towards homogeneity, but it is in fact a will towards the intensification of harmonic beauty, through the unification of differences into organic wholes. This will unto numinosity, as I have described it, demands separation and differentiation. As ever greater forms of separation come to be more thoroughly integrated into the cosmic symphony, this intensity of unity comes to actualize itself in a compositional dance of light and darkness, order and chaos, form and formlessness. What the narrative of Christ then illustrates is that human subjectivity is of absolutely central significance within this dialectical journey. The I amness of human consciousness is the apex of separation and alienation from the cosmos itself. It is the ultimate abandonment of human Dasein by being, to once again borrow from Martin Heidegger. This ultimate separation of subjective and cosmic awareness, despite the agony of such alienation, allows for the possibility that human individuality might come to embody the powers of creative and moral freedom, which were once attributed exclusively to the divine. It is through the achievement of such freedom, then, that human subjectivity is able to resolve the agonizing dissonance of its own alienation by reintegrating itself with the cosmic symphony. Through the harmonization of such ultimate dissonance, ultimate intensity of numinosity is thereby achieved. It is through the mystery of Golgotha, therefore, that the path forward unto the destiny of individual human subjectivity was disclosed. Nevertheless, the fundamental tension between light and darkness within the core of the human psyche would yet stand in need of resolution. Westerners would begin a process of increasing subjectivization, as the Christian mythos began to reorganize the Western collective unconscious over the course of the Middle Ages, coming to an apex during the Renaissance and early modern periods. Throughout these historical transformations, what we see is the gradual absorption of I amness from the cosmos as such and into the human psyche, such that human consciousness itself would become a cavernous inner space of self-reflective subjectivity. As this process unfolded, this would result in an ever greater intensification of the human ego's individuality, as well as its creative and moral agency. However, this process would also result in ever greater alienation of human subjectivity from the cosmos. The disclosure of private, interior awareness opened the possibility of seeing consciousness itself as a feature of humans alone among all other organisms, as we see in Descartes' conjecture that all other plants and animals are merely automatons. Similarly, this process would also result in human beings coming to see forms themselves as projections of the human mind rather than contents of the world itself, a process which began with the nominalism of medieval scholastic philosophy during the 13th century. Ideas came to be understood as mere categories, which the human mind used to intellectualize nature rather than being forms which actually directed the formative processes of nature. In various ways, therefore, Western consciousness would increasingly come to find itself within a de-animated world of mere matter. Even before the advent of mechanistic materialism and atheism during the 19th century, 17th and 18th century deism had already come to see the natural world as an inanimate clockwork, which was designed and set in motion by a god who was now conceptualized as a sort of transcendental engineer. Without such divine engineering, there would be nothing more than void, darkness, and chaos, which were of course regarded as standing in direct opposition to the virtuous order imposed by divine light. These transformations illustrate that as the individuality of the human ego came to further develop in the wake of Christianity, human subjectivity came to experience an ever more acute sense of alienation from the natural world and from the fathomless chora which lies beneath and within the natural world. as the mechanistic dualism of Cartesian philosophy gave way to the thoroughly sterilized world of 19th century physicalist monism, the human relationship with death would likewise become increasingly antagonistic. Death came to be seen not as a process of spiritual transformation, but rather as the mere cessation of consciousness, the mere plunging of human awareness into the incomprehensible non-being of the Quora, from which there was no possibility of escape. Death had simply become non-comprehensible to the modern psyche, and as such, death anxiety and its various pathological outgrowths came to plague the modern world. The sheer irony within this narrative cannot be understated. The phases of human individuation which followed the Christ event were set in motion precisely by the Ouroboros closure of transcendental light and immanent darkness within the incarnation of the cosmic Logos. Furthermore, the subjectivization of human selfhood was itself a process by which the inner space, or inner void of human awareness, came to be disclosed. Yet even as the inner darkness of human subjectivity came to be revealed, our relationship with outer darkness came to be one of ever-increasing alienation, ambivalence, and indeed, violent coercion. Within his 1954 essay, The Question Concerning Technology, Martin Heidegger attempts to illustrate the manner in which the essence of modern technology is fundamentally distinct from all pre-modern forms of technics. Here, Heidegger builds upon his distinction between Zuhandenheit, the ready at hand, and Vorhandenheit, the present at hand. Within Heidegger's thought, these two principles represent two distinct orientations, or attunements, of human consciousness within the world, and consequently, two distinct modalities of world disclosure, which are facilitated by such attunement. We can understand this distinction by examining a simple tool such as a hammer. When a carpenter is using a hammer in his daily work, the hammer is disclosed in the mode of the ready at hand, Zuhandenheit. Insofar as the hammer is doing its job effectively and the carpenter knows what he is doing, the hammer effectively dissolves into the background of the life world which it is interwoven with. The hammer becomes transparent, as it were, and it is able to participate in its world in a seamlessly organic manner. If the hammer breaks or otherwise is unable to perform its task effectively, then we may then begin to attune ourselves towards the hammer in a more objectifying way. We begin to abstract the hammer from its ontological ecology such that we are regarding it as an independent, isolated entity, and moreover as a problem to be solved. We are now disclosing the hammer in the modality of the present at hand, Vorhandenheit. And as such, the hammer is excised from its life world and is rendered as an inert object which is to be subjected to the calculative, instrumental reasoning of human artifice. Within the question concerning technology, Heidegger shows the manner by which modern technology is not merely a means to an end, but rather modern technology has effectively come to be an organ of perception, which discloses the world exclusively in the modality of the present at hand. As this occurs, the world comes to be inframed, such that the only aspects of being which come to light are those which are relevant to the calculative instrumentality of Vorhandenheit. A simple wooden bridge is a kind of technology which allows human beings to span a river. The bridge comes to incorporate the river into the human life world, and it facilitates a deepening of our relationship to the river. We can now gaze down from the bridge into the river, or fish from the river, and the river comes to be a kind of permeable membrane within the human life world rather than a boundary between the human world and untamed wilderness. A hydroelectric dam, by contrast, completely transforms the metaphysical relationship between the river and the human life world. The hydroelectric dam facilitates an orientation towards the river, which renders the river as a body of resources to be extracted from. The river comes to be inframed, such that it manifests primarily as a standing reserve of power, which can be coercively wielded. The river is thereby unworlded. This orientation of inframing attempts to impose calculative, procedural order upon the world. The inherent darkness, unpredictability, and indeterminacy of the world comes to be regarded in a highly adversarial manner as the formlessness of embodied existence. That is, the very materiality of matter itself comes to be regarded as a challenge to be overcome, a blemish to be polished away by the incessant march of techno-scientific progress. The ideology of mechanistic materialism which underlies such technology is not an overemphasis on the ontological significance of materiality. Quite the contrary, such materialism is, ironically, a violent war on the very materiality of embodied existence. Seen within the broader scope of our journey, we can now begin to see clearly that all of these developments are in fact manifestations of the same underlying process, one by which the individualization of human consciousness has resulted in an ever more acute alienation from the dark, groundless ground from which all embodied existence comes to be born. The impulse towards the technological unworlding of the world can be seen as a symptom of the very same pathological compulsion which manifests at an individual level as the psychosexual fixations of male serial killers, the need to conquer and destroy an archetypal femininity which human beings feel themselves to be abandoned and betrayed by. Scientific materialism, ironically, reveals itself to be precisely the erasure of embodied materiality through inframing, by which the immanent, embodied experience of nature comes to be replaced by mathematical abstractions which serve as lifeless imitations and as tools through which the technological domination of the bodily realm can be further facilitated. Modern science and technology have become unconscious actors, which obsessively reenact the struggle with divine darkness which we see within the writings of Plato and Plotinus, and which we see enacted in an even more explicitly archetypal manner within the Sumerian myth of Marduk and Tiamat. All of Western philosophy is indeed footnotes to Plato, and in that sense the entire history of Western thought can further be understood as repeatedly reenacting the dialectical dance of light and darkness which we find to be the innermost core of the Platonic tradition. Seen within the context of individuation, this dance of light and darkness is revealed to be a macrocosmic and indeed cosmogonic enactment of the ceaseless dialectic of masculine and feminine principles. Individuation is a process which begins with a catabolic separation, one which involves the overcoming of trials, the endurance of pain, and the germination of individuality and self-efficacy. Following this separation, however, there must then be a process of reintegration, through which the powers cultivated by the soul must be harmonized with the world which it was cast out of or abandoned by. Without such reintegration, the alienated ego comes to devolve into ever more pathological forms. In order to complete the cycle of collective individuation, which we now find ourselves within, modern human subjectivity must come to reintegrate itself with the darkness of materiality, which Western consciousness, including so-called scientific materialism, has been attempting to neutralize, dominate, or evade over the course of the past several millennia. Modern consciousness, in other words, must come to reintegrate the hidden fourth, which has been so long obscured within the metaphysical horizon of triadic completeness. In order for the Christification of human consciousness to be fully realized, the human ego must re-encounter the primordial womb from which it was born. The ego must be abyssated, taking on the formless form of the Marian womb, such that the light of the Logos can come to be rekindled within it. Western Neoplatonic consciousness must renegotiate its relationship with the cosmic void which ultimately is the long-sought prima materia. Christic consciousness must come to see that the closed unity of the Trinity is only able to be world-generative in relation to the boundlessness of the quaternity, which is completed by the Marian face of the deep, the oceanic womb of the Stella Maris, and Western science must come to see that its ever-elusive ether is in fact the negation of negation. In its efforts to do so, Western consciousness will be required to integrate into itself elements of Indic and Far Eastern cosmologies, which have been characterized by far less antagonistic relationships to the abyssal Kora. The number 0 was brought to Europe during the 13th century from the Islamic world, which in turn had derived the concept of zero from India. It was during this exact time period that Christian mystics such as Meister Eckhart, Angela of Foligno, and Hadewig of Antwerp came into contact with what they described as the fathomless, abyssal darkness of God. Western consciousness, even long before Christianity and even before Plato, was an awareness which oriented itself towards futurity and destiny. Eastern consciousness, correlatively, has tended much more towards the repetition of the past. The linearity of the former and the circularity of the latter must be integrated so as to form the spiral of a truly evolutionary self-awareness, one which is able to contend with the fathomless freedom, which is both the microcosmic ground of the human soul and the macrocosmic ground of existence as such. The next major series of videos I will be working on will be a reworking of the first series of videos I ever created for this channel. That initial handful of videos covered Jean Gebser's magnum opus, The Ever-Present Origin. And in the next series of videos, we will be diving very, very deep into Gebser's thought. As such, I think it's appropriate that I end this video with a quote from The Ever-Present Origin. Quote, "We are closer to the abyss than we wish to admit, but it is fortunate that we have an insight into the fact that we are the abyss. Each of us must have this insight in order to prevail over the abyss at the very least in the hour of our death, and if such insight is not gained until then, this hour will be one of bitterness and terror." Thanks for watching.